There are 135 million tons of carbon being underreported by these large firms. That means that there are 135 million tons in the air that we are not accounting for.
These are not even the total emissions. These are just the level of misstatements of the emissions are as big as major fossil fuel producers like Venezuela, like Kuwait, like Qatar. And so these are big, high-profile numbers. They matter.
Where we started this project was in collecting ESG or CSR reports for companies. We spent a lot of time reading these reports, and one thing that popped out early on was that numbers often changed, or they got numbers wrong that were easy to verify. To give you an example, American Airlines misreported the gender diversity of its board, which was very easy to check because you go into the proxy statement, you can count the pictures. And so that got us thinking, well, how often do they get numbers wrong? And we started with Scope 1 emissions because this is a number that is almost uniformly reported in these reports.
And so we thought at the beginning, we're like, oh, this is awesome. Firms are leading us straight to the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And so we went to look at this pot of gold, and unfortunately, the pot of gold kept changing. Firms, turns out, understate their emissions significantly more than they overstate them, which is to say that they report a number like 100, and then they go in the future back to say, oh, did we say 100? We meant 250. When we think about the direction of misstatements, they matter. You might expect that if misstatements were happening just because we're mismeasuring something or some other measurement tool we're changing over time, or the kinds of things we were measuring is changing over time, then maybe sometimes we're understating, sometimes we're overstating, and that's going to wash out. Well, it turns out here it doesn't wash out. So what we find in this project is that 58% of publicly traded firms' reported emissions are misstated. The reason that matters is that these are relied upon by regulators, by investors, and even by the companies themselves. And so if we're having that level of restatements, that suggests that there's something within this reporting process that is off and that we need to fix.
When we first learned about the high rate of revisions, we were really surprised. Our first thought was, this is really great for us as researchers and really horrible for the planet.
What really mattered then was just the frequency with which these mistakes happen and the magnitude of these mistakes. And so that's exactly what we looked into next. And then a third piece that we looked at, which is direction, that really surprised us.
We ran several regressions to understand what's driving these restatements, whether there are systematic practices that would do this, such as rule change within an industry, firm size, institutional holdings, all these different factors. And what we find is, surprisingly, that none of these really effectively explain restatement. So every firm is as likely as any other firm to do this. One of the interesting things we find is that the institutional characteristics put in place to address misstatements or restatements of emissions have no predictive power of whether firms are going to revise their emissions or not. So, one growing practice is for firms to have assurance for their emissions numbers. Basically, it's a form of auditing of the methodology. And there we find no predictive power, no relation between assurance and revisions. Same thing, institutional investors tend to be a check on firms' reporting. And there as well, we don't find that the amount of institutional holdings predict revisions one way or the other. $135 million tons of emissions. This is what companies are underreporting in our analysis. And to put that into context, that is more emissions than Nigeria, Kuwait, Qatar, and Venezuela, all major petroleum exporting countries. Corporate emissions are important because corporations, especially large corporations, are some of the largest emitters in the world. If we want to address climate change through emissions reductions, we need to hold corporations responsible. We also need corporations to have information to act on their current emissions and make efforts to reduce them. In addition, stakeholders, whether they be investors, activists, or governments, have a hard time holding them accountable if we don't know exactly how much they're actually emitting. And so without good information, firms don't really know how to act.
Armed now with this new knowledge that we have, a natural question is, gosh, is this just the way that corporations report things, that they have to go back and they correct them? And so what's nice here is that we actually have a great control sample to look at, and that is within their financial statements. So we've been collecting financial data on firms now for really hundreds of years, and so we can see how they report their financial health and see if that behavior is any different between this and carbon reporting. And what we found is that it's vastly different. So to give you an idea of magnitude here, 58% of publicly traded firms' reported emissions are misstated. That equivalent number for financial statements, 2%. So now we're talking about 30x, 30 times the amount of misstatements. So this is not something inherent about the way firms are measuring their activities.
We don't really know why companies are getting this wrong because companies don't spend a lot of time talking about it. We find that in a few instances, companies actually note the revision and explain why it happens, but that is very rare. When that happens, companies tend to attribute it to methodological changes, errors in the data or in the measurement system, or changes in the boundary of the firm, so mergers, acquisitions, or dispositions. But that only explains a very small sample of the observations. Overall, we don't find any concrete evidence as to why firms are revising. One potential explanation that we investigate where we find some associative evidence is executive compensation. So we find that once executive compensation is tied to emissions reductions, executives take greater interest in revisions. And we find that they are more likely to make revisions that would make it easier to obtain objectives. Specifically, what we find is that when an executive has incentives tied to emissions reduction, they're more likely to upwardly revise emissions prior to the incentives. So in other words, they increase older emissions reporting, which would make it easier for them to obtain their compensation if it's based on reductions because the baseline is higher. We also find that after they get these incentives, they're more likely to underreport emissions in future years, again, making it easier for them to obtain these incentives because they're reporting lower numbers in the period in which they are incentivized, higher numbers in the prior periods, which makes the emissions reduction look greater.
If you're an investor that cares about emissions, why is this important? Well, the reason that this is important is that if you're either the end client that you have cares about these emissions, or you do, and that's a service you provide, then you need to be able to measure this, right? And if you go to them and say, your portfolio generated this in emissions last year, and the next year you're like, oh, I was totally kidding, it was something that was far higher, then look, you're not really doing your job in a way that aligns with what you said you were going to do.
So there are lots of stakeholders who use these data. There is a growing body of research on the relation between firms' emissions and firms' financial performance, for example. And it makes sense. Firms that have more emissions might actually have greater performance because they're putting out more effort, or they might have worse performance because they are not efficient in their practices. So that's one area where we see it a lot. Another is investors. Investors, both investors that do ESG investing, but also large asset managers who are concerned about systemic risk and want to push firms to address big societal problems. They all rely on these data fairly heavily. Governments as well need these data to figure out how to hold firms accountable. We're seeing an increase in emissions around the globe being taxed, and so they need these data to figure out how to tax the companies that are producing them. I think that regulation would make a big difference in improving the integrity of these data. The SEC has had proposals that have now died on requiring corporate emissions reporting, but really we're not going to get to reliable emissions reporting without firm rules and some kind of consequence for misreporting, which can only really arise with regulation.
There are states that are moving ahead, like California, to try and be leaders within the space in terms of what they are now requiring firms to do. I unfortunately don't think that's a great path forward, and we haven't seen that be a great path forward more broadly. And the reason is that once you have certain states imposing one set of rules and another state imposing another set of rules, that's both difficult for firms, in fairness to them, because many of them operate in many different states, and so they need to then understand that. And very difficult for investors. That, to me, is a path to more gridlock in this space. And in this case, I really see the need for a central authority doing this, which is an SEC, or even some global governing body imposing this on firms. That's going to help the world to understand through that transparency.
My message to investors and companies that are reading this report is that we all believe that emissions reporting is important. If we believe that firms have a role in addressing climate change, we need accurate reporting. The way to get to accurate reporting is to hold companies accountable for the emissions that they are reporting right now, to ensure accuracy, and to communicate effectively when they have to change those numbers because they found errors in the data.
So here's the bright spot that we found when doing this research. It turns out that firms are not mandated to disclose any real level of kind of granularity within what they do on carbon emissions at this point. And yet what we saw is that firms were trying. Firms were trying to put numbers out there. They were trying to give detail. They were going back and correcting these emissions when they thought there were errors. We talked to a number of people at these top firms and reporting agencies, and they cared. And so in that sense, we were heartened by the fact that the market understands that this is important. And at this point, they just really don't know how to do it. And there's enough flexibility that some of these outside incentives can seep their way in enough to make these numbers less interpretable than they should be. But we at least have part of the world, and here the corporate world, that is galvanized to make a difference.
I'm optimistic that we have opportunities to move toward better data because all we need is one large economy, be it California, be it Europe, be it the United States, to mandate that firms disclose emissions as a cost of doing business. And we will start to see firms disclosing this information in an accurate way.